everyone. My name's David Righton. I work at the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. So we're an agency of government, more commonly known as Cefas. So you may know us as that. And as Nita said, I'm lead for our ecosystem resilience science theme. I'll be talking to you today about how we can make more effective use of evidence to help marine nature recovery. It's been a really thought-provoking and stimulating day for me. There's a lot of concepts I've been introduced to, a lot of ideas, and a lot of new people that I've met today. I've got a lot to take away from today, and I'm really grateful to the organisers for giving me the opportunity to speak and to perhaps, put some of the ideas forward that I and my colleagues at Cefas and more widely have. And what I'll be talking to you about today is some work that we started in the sort of late summer of 2025. With my colleagues Murray Thompson and Beth Gilly, we started a bit of a consultation process using an opportunity we had at a conference Cefas organised in the summer to talk to a whole range of different interested parties, if you like, or interest groups within the marine field to try and find out what was it that was required by way of evidence, or how evidence should be used to help recover and restore nature. And perhaps in talking through some of these preliminary results that we've got, be able to address some of these questions we've been talking about today. So just pausing for a moment to sort of think about this question: what is marine nature? What is it to you? I look out over the audience here and I can see a few familiar faces that I might see at sort of marine-focused events, but largely I feel we've talked a lot today about terrestrial systems and solutions in terrestrial or freshwater systems, but not a huge amount about marine ecosystems. So it's worthwhile just thinking about that for a moment. When was your last interaction with the sea or with the ocean? What did you do? Did you go for a walk by the sea? Did you go out on the sea? Perhaps you ate some seafood. Or perhaps you just charged your mobile phone using power from offshore wind energy. For us at Cefas, all of these things, food, raw materials, energy, carbon cycling, and the buffer of the sea and other marine habitats, as a buffer for climate change, the biodiversity. These are all ecosystem services that have a value and need to be accounted for, understood, quantified. But it's a really difficult environment to work in because, unlike terrestrial environments, typically what most people experience and what we have to work from is the sea surface. Much of what we need to measure is hidden and unseen, and it's distant and inaccessible. So it's harder work, perhaps, to collect data. Data are fewer, it's more uncertain. And so when we collect that data, it's very valuable. But when we use that data, there are more issues to overcome. It's funny, though, because despite that inaccessibility in terms of collecting data, the ecosystems in the marine environment are not inaccessible to impact. In fact, they are widely impacted, and we know that they're widely impacted. These impacts are not different to marine ecosystems than those in terrestrial systems, and nor are they particularly new. But because those data are harder to collect, takes a little bit longer to understand, a little bit uncertain, and how we might manage interventions in order to help to recover and restore those ecosystems. And it takes a little bit longer to get to. Just taking a few examples, really, and you're probably very familiar with these. Marine litter is an issue that's come into the public consciousness, quite dramatically in the last few years. And a significant volume of plastic enters the seas and the ocean environment in various different forms. It's found in all marine ecosystems, really, even those in the very deep sea. Where it can have a variety of different impacts. It's consumed by all sorts of creatures at all sorts of scale within the marine environment with various different effects. Plastic can act as a vector for diseases and bacteria and therefore change the way that diseases are transported around the world. And macroplastics like fishing gear can come to rest on the seabed and continue to catch fish or cause mortalities of other marine creatures for years unintentionally, but still significantly. Climate change is another issue, of course, that affects all ecosystems, but it can be in some places within our marine environment particularly rapid, and that causes changes in the structure and geography of communities. We've seen this happen, within the North Sea, but of course it's happening globally. Species assemblages are changing. The size compositions of those species communities are changing. The way that energy moves between different trophic layers is changing, and the way that habitats store carbon and cycle carbon is changing. Marine heat waves are something that we're starting to hear about on a regular basis, and their consequences can be quite unpredictable. I mean, my third example, and it's the one that people often think of first, I suspect, is fishing. Global capture fisheries are enormously significant, contribute to global food security, and are really important economically and socially. But they also have impacts on ecosystems. They can change the way that energy moves between different trophic layers. They can change the structure of systems. And of course, sorry, I've just kind of skipped ahead in my notes. But also they catch species that are not targets, and in terms of bycatch, that can lead to issues with higher trophic levels of large predators, mammals, and so on. And balancing the competing uses of the sea in terms of space, also for offshore energy, of course, is really, really critical. The thing about these three examples that I've given you is that you probably are familiar with many of these things, and how they might act at a local level. But they also act at a sort of regional, national, and global level. So you may have taken part in litter picks on beaches to help clean up beaches or so on, or you may have thought about ways in which fishing gears could be adapted to make them less damaging to, for example, the seabed. So things can be adjusted at a local level that will have impacts at a global level. And it's this link between these actions and these large-scale problems that I think is really sort of a theme that's come through today. One of our sort of goals at Cefas, we're an evidence collection organization. Our role is to collect data, to analyze data, to create evidence, and then to use that, in collaboration with other partners in government and more widely to sort of to use that evidence and use that evidence in evidence-based policies. I can't think of an example of work that I've done or my colleagues have been involved with, which doesn't work towards some sort of evidence-based policy, either in terms of how that policy was created or how the effectiveness of that policy is measured in terms of science-based targets. But of course, evidence collection is a really huge and significant task. In the marine environment, space is particularly important because of these different scales at which evidence needs to be collected. And that scale, of course, involves different users. And generating evidence is really just the first part of the story, I think, because it needs to lead to action. One of the critical things is not just generating evidence that can be used, but actually making it used. And I think this is a phase that we're moving into now, and this is the one thing that we really wanted to think about as part of our consultation process. We're very comfortable with collecting data through monitoring programs and so on, but those data then need to be used in collaboration with other partners, other users, and other interest groups. So we wanted to find out people's perspectives on this, and to understand how perhaps we, as an evidence collection and provider organization, could make ourselves more effective and work more effectively with others to make sure that we can help to tackle these really important challenges. So how did we do that? Well, as I mentioned, we had a conference in 2025 called Cefas Future Ocean. We had this sort of scale, not perhaps as large a scale online, but we were able to sort of leverage that opportunity. We had an invite list, and we selected 40 individuals from our initial invite list at random from across that. That's about 25% of the attendees on the day. And we asked them if they'd be willing to take part in some structured interviews so that we could understand their perspectives about the health of the marine environment, the threats to the marine environment, and what needs to be done to help recover and restore it. To really try and get this cross-sectoral question, where is the consensus on how we use evidence, and where might there not be consensus? And we used our findings from that in an interactive poll on the day of the conference to try and dive into some of the issues that arose from those initial structured interviews to try and get a wider perspective. And so I'm going to share some of those results with you today, and to try and sort of, I think, broadly agrees with some of the things that we've been hearing about in how we should make evidence use more effective. But what I should stress is that these are just preliminary results. They've not been published yet, but we're working those up, and hopefully they'll be published very soon. So we asked at first, some of our early questions were, what do people think about the state of the environment? We asked this question in a couple of ways just to make sure that we'd approach this from different angles, that we weren't actually getting results that were based around our wording of the question, and they were actually genuinely related to people's feelings. And it was fairly clear that there's strong consensus across different groups, be that government organizations, academic institutes, NGOs, or industry or user groups, that their assessment of the state of the environment was not good. It was not in a healthy state, and it was generally in a relatively poor state. Different sectors drew on different types of evidence to come to that conclusion. So academic groups, for example, were more likely to draw upon published information in academic journals and so on, whereas those who work in government and government organizations commonly talked about and referred to government targets, government frameworks, and policies that they were involved in, but their views were essentially the same. Climate change was identified as the predominant threat, but fishing, biodiversity loss, and cumulative human pressures were widely acknowledged to be significant threats, these interactive stresses. Thank you. And these will undermine recovery efforts. Importantly, beyond just that diagnosis of poor health, this consensus extended to the sense that action was urgently needed. There was also broad agreement between sectors that there is actually enough evidence of interventions that can achieve recovery. But the challenge is that it's not happening enough or fast enough, and it's not effective enough. So whether these are direct interventions to restore ecosystems, or whether these are more passive approaches to reducing pressures and allow that restoration to occur, naturally, it didn't matter. There was agreement that these things were known about and could be put into action, but were not currently effective enough. And there were calls for a restoration culture and a national strategy. And it's brilliant to see in Sally's talk, of course, that there is a strategy for nature recovery that Natural England have been setting out, and that's also aligned to their science and evidence strategies. So, and hopefully, Sally, we're starting to address the question at the very end of your presentation: is there enough evidence, and what more is needed? Critically, of course, spatial management in the marine environment is very important, particularly considering concerns about spatial squeeze and just how much competition there is for different space. And there are so many multiple competing demands. So far, everyone seems to be agreeing, in these questions that we've been asking. We're getting a remarkable amount of consensus, even across these, apparently differing groups. But dissensus occurs where, when we started asking questions about how we need to use evidence for nature recovery. And this is the thing that we felt, was the really standout result, with a huge agreement on all of the issues, but actually, what do you then do about them? And some sectors, NGOs, for example, and academics, expressed a lot of optimism about how we could scale up restoration projects and pilots that they had taken part in order to help recover coastal systems. But others refer to things like regulatory inertia and the difficulties of resolving differences in the requirements of different user groups. And some stakeholders differed in their ideas of what restored ecosystems should look like as well, with some focusing particularly on the future and others looking more towards historical baselines. So how do we reconcile all of this? How do we get to some sort of consensus then on how we should develop this strategy? And I think one of the key things that we identified, and again has come up as a topic today, is trying to get some sort of agreement on what future nature or what nature recovery looks like across these different interest groups. And that's a really critical thing, because it may not look like the past and possibly can't look like the past. but it certainly will need to be something that we agree on if we are to define criteria for how to move forward. And in our view, data and evidence are at the heart of this, because this is something that we can all coalesce around. So summing up, although marine issues are perhaps less well represented in these fora, perhaps because there is a lag, or perhaps because marine issues are more challenging in some ways because of the distances and difficulties of working in distant marine environments, many of the challenges and solutions are common. We've found that the views and opinions seem to be quite consensual, that there's a lot of consensus there, but how do we actually turn evidence to achieve action at different scales? So we need to foster perhaps some more of these cross-sector relationships and communities of practice to help find out what nature recovery looks like, so that we can build collaborations that join up evidence, practice, and evaluation, and ensure that future interventions have the best chance at being effective in recovering the health of our marine ecosystems and marine nature. Thanks very much for listening.